All right, so this is going to be a big video. It's probably going to be long. This is breaking news. This is cutting edge perspective. I guarantee you, you are not going to hear anywhere else. So congrats on being ahead of the curve, and please participate in the comments section and share your insights as well. Now, here are some of the things that we need to talk about in depth tonight. And again, we're going to be exploring these from angles that most people are not. Iran nuclear facilities. Was it an attack that recently happened in the last 24 hours or worse? I'll talk about what I mean by worse in just a moment. Moscow endured its largest ever drone attack in the past 24 hours. Ukraine endured its largest ever drone attack in the last 24 hours. Yemen has hijacked even more commercial vessels. One, in fact, exchanged hands a couple times. It appears as though the U.S. military may have taken it back. We still don't have all the details as of yet. We have one of the worst droughts across the entire American hemisphere happening as we speak. NATO is about to enter the Black Sea with warships. Yes, you heard correct. We have to talk about the coming oil crisis and things they are not telling you, things that people just do not think about, 4D chess moves that I'm going to break down today. We have to talk about the coming immigration crisis that will result from the war that's about to start in the Middle East. We need to talk about the U.S. Dwight Eisenhower aircraft carrier finally entering the Strait of Hormuz. We need to issue a warning about AI and World War III. We got to talk about the Baltic border crisis with Russia. We need to talk about the U.S., which is now ramping up nuclear fissionable materials for a mass production of weapons of mass destruction. Okay, we got to talk about blowback from sanctions and why the Axis nations are increasingly getting more powerful and more consolidated. We also need to talk about why the weather will dictate everything about the battlefields on which World War III will be fought. There's that old saying, warfare is all about logistics. Well, before that, it's about weather. And there are certain windows of opportunity that nations have to seize upon if they do want to fight various wars. Now, where do I even begin today? How do I possibly triage this information appropriately? Well, let's just talk about the massive drone attack on Moscow and what that is all about. 20 drones were sent into the Moscow region. 20 Iranian drones. For perspective, that is hundreds of kilometers away from the Ukrainian border. In most cases, I believe Moscow is around 500 kilometers away, if not more than that. So understand that this is using sophisticated drone technology, possibly even guided by Starlink, which of course the United States military commandeered from Elon Musk several months ago. But understand what exactly they're trying to do here. With these drone strikes, they know that these are Pyrrhic victories at best. There have been some attacks on transformers in and around Moscow. We know transformers are the linchpins of the power grid. These things take a long time to rebuild. So if you lose one, chances are you're going to be without power for some time. Now, unless they were going for high-level assassinations or these key nodes in the critical infrastructural network to take out, it's very likely that these are probing operations, surveillance and reconnaissance operations that kind of masquerade as attacks, okay? And who is at the helm of all of this? Who is funding all this? Well, it remains that NATO continues to be the one who is bankrolling this stuff going on in Ukraine still. So what does that mean to Moscow to know that your defenses are currently being probed by NATO? Because understand, when World War III begins, it's going to be all about how can we get our missiles to the key targets within your country. Now, Moscow doesn't have the luxury right now of sending probes into the United States. So that puts them at a strategic disadvantage. When a nation is at a strategic disadvantage, they become more likely, not less likely, to contemplate a preemptive nuclear strike. Why? Because they're at a disadvantage. They're at a disadvantage if war breaks out. So understand that with these frequent probing operations, we are obviously testing the patience and resolve and restraint of the Russians not to respond in any sort of brash manner that might, trigger World War III. So that's exactly what these are, I believe, these drone operations. They're not related to making the actual attack. Maybe they are, maybe they're to show the Russians that, we can penetrate deep into their territory. When I say we, of course, I'm referring to NATO, Ukraine being a proxy of. So what is it really all about? I do believe probing operations for when the inevitable bombs fly between NATO and the Baltic states. There may even be something ado, because remember, these drones are making it that far in to Russia. Prior to this war's beginning, people would have presumed that these drones would have made it a few kilometers over the border. But we're learning that Russia is a very big space, okay? If you're looking at the Iron Dome situation with a thin Gaza Strip, now imagine the amount of border and the amount of coverage that Russia needs to cover. Okay, so we're starting to get some real perspective because I think a lot of us had misconceptions about how air defense works, and it's not as foolproof. It is not as exhaustive of the airspace as many people originally thought it would be. It's something just doesn't cross the border and immediately it gets shot down, especially when you have commercial flights in the sky. That is the other problem. So this was the largest ever attack on Moscow today. Now there's been attacks on Moscow heating up again. I don't know if we're just hearing about them more once again, but there's been all kinds of explosions, saboteurs operating behind enemy lines. For the last week or so, I've been seeing a lot more of these incidents happening once again. So the attacks on these asymmetrical attacks inside of Russia are starting to ramp up again. What does that all mean is the question. Well, everybody talks about how Ukraine is out of this fight and Ukraine is looking at what may well be its final total full-scale mobilization, total war, okay? Is that really the case? What would the possible purpose then of these drone attacks be if that was the case? Are they trying to soften up the Russians for when they eventually go to war with the Baltic states? And you're noticing now that all of this talk about Ukraine potentially having to go to a negotiating table is coinciding with what is happening in the Baltic states. Okay, so the Baltic states are starting to consider closing their borders. What happened before all of this stuff started? You had that major border dispute between Belarus and Poland. That preceded the war that we are currently seeing in Ukraine. Now you have nations shuttering their borders across the board from Lithuania to Estonia to Finland. Even Norway is talking about that thin border they have up there with Russia, shutting that down. So something is definitely in the works. You have 3 aircraft carriers in the Baltic Sea. Talks about forming a blockade against the Russians within that region. You have more nuclear weapons moving closer to Russia's borders. That is, Russian nuclear weapons, repositioning them closer to NATO's borders, of course, as a show of force. As a deterrence, you have the Baltic states moving in more troops, Poland moving in more troops. So something is most definitely going on within that theater. Now, we need to talk about what is going on with the Iranian nuclear facility, because something happened at the Iranian nuclear facility of Isfahan. Now, I believe that this is for research reactors and uranium conversion. Apparently, explosions were heard, and there was anti-aircraft guns heard in the region. The Iranian military is saying that these were just exercises, okay? But some people are speculating that maybe these weren't exercises, that this was in fact an attack by somebody on these facilities. Now, I'm going to tell you why I think if it was an attack, or if it wasn't, it really doesn't matter, because the simple fact that they're conducting these drills in the first place is telling you that they are getting ready to defend their nuclear facilities against Israel and the United States. Now, I can't go into great depth about all the the controversy over what's going with Iran, but essentially what's happening is they're restricting access of the International Atomic Energy Agency, who's supposed to oversee the enrichment of uranium. Now, they're not completely restricting access. They say they're still complying to a certain extent. However, the Israelis and the Americans disagree. So with the Iranians conducting these exercises and sort of tangentially broadcasting that they're doing it, not officially providing many details, but putting Israel and the United States on notice that we have deterrence in this capacity, it also demonstrates, it also would make one think that, well, maybe they are up to something, right? So, and maybe they aren't. Maybe they're just, you know, rightfully trying to defend their sovereign soil from U.S. and Israeli meddling. However, this will not be taken well by the Americans and the Israelis, so it increases the likelihood that we are going to eventually see that sort of intervention from the United States, who now has had it ratified in the House Resolution 559 that they have the license to go to war with the Iranians under House Res 559 if they suspect that Iran is enriching uranium beyond what was originally agreed upon by the JCPOA. It's only a matter of time before Iran's nuclear program not only matures, but before they do eventually get nuclear weapons. And of course, if Iran gets nuclear weapons, that means that the United States can't declare war on them, right? Because then they'll utilize those nuclear weapons, at least in theory. So you can't go to war, otherwise they would have taken over North Korea long ago. So the last thing they want is the IRGC, who has influence in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, the Gaza Strip. The last thing they want to do is allow them to get nuclear weapons, because that would be, you know, the death knell for petrodollar dominance and Zionist dominance within the Middle East, for lack of better terms. Okay, I just use that political term Zionism as to, in its political sense, to try to encapsulate what's going on here when you look at the alliance between Israel and the United States. So that all comes under threat. And when that comes under threat and you have heavier-handed Iranian influence within the region, that means the Saudis are on edge. And of course, yes, the Saudis could get oil. Understand what is happening right now with the U.S. oil. Maybe I should just, okay, before I go there, a lot of people are talking about strategic oil reserve. Why are we still exporting oil? I'm going to get into all that in just a minute. But price of uranium has doubled in the past year. Why has it doubled in the past year? Well, for starters, they're building more nuclear weapons with this stuff. That's what's going on. The United States has opened various pit mines. This was just reported by the Telegraph. They are mining more uranium for the purpose of nuclear weapons. So part of this, and they get all that nuclear material from Russia that Russia continues to sell the United States. And the reason that the Russians are providing, because they provide a special enriched form of uranium that only U.S. nuclear facilities can use, or it's the type of stuff that the U.S. nuclear facilities need. Okay, so they're not entirely decoupled from the Russian economy yet. So they've been stockpiling it, knowing that eventually they will have to go to war with the Russians. The United States has over 50 nuclear reactors. I think the actual number is around 61 or 61 facilities, and then around 100 reactors across those facilities, many of which require that fuel from Russia. So they've been stockpiling it in anticipation of inevitable war with Russia, okay, and idea that eventually Russia is going to cut us off. Now you might be asking, why is Russia still selling the United States this stuff? Well, it has a lot to do with industry. It has a lot to do with money. You know, they're making a lot of money right now. The price of uranium is doubled, and you might say, well, doesn't national security trump the money that they would be making? You would be correct. However, I still think right now they're playing it as such as they don't see it as necessarily a threat. And when you think about World War III asymmetry, and this is something I haven't heard anybody else say. Maybe it gets brought up in high-level military strategist meetings, but the countries with the greatest amount of nuclear power plants are at the greatest risk when the shit hits the fan. So in Russia, for example, they have, I believe, 11 nuclear facilities, and across those, their facilities tend to be a lot bigger, I believe, so they have about 50 reactors, but they're concentrated in certain places, as opposed to the United States, who has way more nuclear facilities spread up and down the East Coast, on the West Coast. Okay, so these are ticking time bombs. In the very least, the spent fuel rods. Yes, they can go into controlled shutdown, you know, if the nuclear bombs drop. But I mean, if a nuke dropped on a nuclear power facility, I mean, that's endgame stuff right there. Okay, because it's much different when that material becomes pulverized and exploded with a nuclear weapon, versus you have all this, you know, spent fuel or undetonated nuclear material just kicked up. Like it would be Chernobyl, but over a very large area. So this is something to think about. So maybe the Russians are just saying to themselves, you know, they're going to get the nuclear material anyways from somewhere. We may as well, you know, allow them to dig their own grave potentially by continuing to fuel these nuclear facilities. And I was one of the only people, I think, that ever speculated that part of the reason why they were shutting down nuclear facilities was in anticipation of, it wasn't ado with the risks of nuclear energy or anything like that. It was more ado with threats of war, as we're seeing right now with the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant that has went into cold shutdown periodically every other week for the last, you know, however many months. Okay, so that was my speculation, but now they're trying to ramp it up again. Okay, so countries are getting desperate for energy because they're seeing all of a sudden, you know, they decouple from Russia, Nord Stream blows up, so everybody wants to build nuclear power plants once again. It's okay now, right? So, but that puts you at a greater risk. So you have to have a very safe, controlled shutdown for these facilities. They have to be in places that they're not going to be threatening. However, they're trying to build these small reactors in and around cities, so I don't know how that's going to work. Not looking good. Okay, so just some food for thought in terms of the calculus of World War III as it pertains to nuclear power plants being potential ticking time bombs. You also have the Dwight Eisenhower strike group has finally entered the Mediterranean in the Strait of Hormuz. Okay, so this is just off the coast of Iran. This would be like, this is a nuclear capable, I don't doubt that there isn't nuclear weapons on this thing. And of course, it's running on nuclear power, so this thing can run indefinitely for 25 years. However, its missiles won't last but a few firefights. I do believe, like a few very intense firefights. These carrier strike groups will run out of stuff eventually. And as the old saying goes with our friend Douglas McGregor, you're a fool for a ship to fight a fort. A ship's a fool to fight a fort, because eventually you run out of stuff unless you can be resupplied. Resupply isn't easy when you're in a high intensity conflict. The Iranians will just overwhelm the warships with missiles, and then once they've depleted their anti-missile defense, that's when they'll start, you know, lobbing their bigger guns at it, and eventually they'll sink it. It's not, you know, the idea that the Iranians can't sink a U.S. aircraft carrier, even with conventional weapons, is incredibly naive, I think. I mean, there's a reason why the carrier strike group that's in the Mediterranean right now is parked so far off the coast with Lebanon, when I think the best they have are these P800 Onyx anti-ship missiles or something like that, but it's not even like the top of the hop. Okay, so the idea that you need zircons and Kinzhal and hypersonics, Fatah 2 and all that stuff to take them out, I think is, yes, maybe that's true when they're fully loaded and ready to go, but you exhaust those things, and you know, how put to the test have these aircraft carriers really been? I mean, really put to the test, right? Like, not just the aircraft carriers themselves, but the whole warship fleet. Like, how many times have they had to endure full-blown, high-intensity conflict for extended periods of time? Those guns, you know, are prone to failure. You know, things break down. Things are prone to failure. And especially when you're using them day after day. And this is what the Russian war machine is geared towards. You guys are probably wondering, why am I in a tent? And if you didn't know, I'm not an honor thief. I'm going to be brutally upfront right now. This is in a studio. We got this tent in a studio. If you missed our Black Friday video, speaking of which, you got a few hours, I believe 6 hours left to capitalize on the 15% off store-wide. Stock up on food, stock up on medical supplies, stock up on weapons, whatever you can find at Canadian Prep. We got pretty much every single thing a prepper would dream of wanting 15% off, no gimmicks, no price adjustments before the day to, you know, try to make sure that we can make our money back. We're eating at a loss for a lot of these things because we do free shipping. But anyways, go capitalize on that. Now back to the most important stuff that we have to talk about today. We got to talk about the Yemenis, who currently have somehow managed to take over more ships, commandeered more vessels. Now, we've been warning about this for a while, okay? Now, some people are saying that this event today that happened with the oil tanker that was hijacked and then taken back by U.S. Special Forces. No surprise that U.S. Special Forces, if oil's involved, it's like, you know, dog ears. Oil's under threat. We got to go and save it, right? They're just, that's how they operate. So, anyways, they were able to successfully take this thing back. So we, you know, we don't even really know at this point in time what all the details of the story are. But the Yemenis were not taking credit, at least not immediately, for the hijacking of this ship. Now, that might have been because things happened so fast that they didn't have time to upload the video and do the typical theatrics that they usually do. Regardless, we are seeing what is unfolding right now. We are now seeing part of the reason why all of these warships are within that region, why the 2,000 Marines were sent to the Persian Gulf months before October 7th, okay? Because they anticipated that things were going to start to heat up once again. And so what this means is that the shipping lanes are most definitely under threat within that region, and that we're going to see more of this. I believe they've now attempted to hijack 4 ships. I think they've successfully hijacked 3, if I'm not mistaken. It might still be 2, but they also attacked a ship, and they've been attacking U.S. warships. So we know that eventually something is going to happen. Now, the U.S. is reluctant to engage in this conflict, and I was, again, one of the first people to bring this up, is that if they were to do this, the potential blowback from that situation would be that the Houthis might threaten the Saudi oil fields or other critical infrastructure in the region that would create an explosion in oil prices, or just target commercial vessels willy-nilly, and nobody will want to sail through the Suez Canal anymore because it would just be too dangerous, okay? They could potentially do that. So the U.S., and this is one thing I'll give Peter Zion credit for. I don't think many of his theories, you know, are going to stand the test of time, so to speak. But especially the one about China collapsing in the next year and a half, I just think that's stupid because their population is ticking downward a little bit. All European countries' populations are ticking down. But anyways, that's another story. One, you know, thing that he has said that I agree with is that the primary purpose of this massive U.S. Navy is to police the waterways. And that's one way that you're able to get the golden global credit card, which is the global reserve currency, so you can continue to print money, is if you have the biggest military. You can guard the vaults, but in addition to that, you also need to be able to be the global police of the waterways. Historically, the United States have been able to do that. However, now the Chinese are building ships at a rapid rate. You have a lot of asymmetrical tactics being employed that are challenging the U.S. Navy's legitimacy within these regions. So the U.S. right now is faced with an impending financial crisis, which can only be staved off, and only, I'd say, in the short term, by keeping inflation down. Inflation is everything. If inflation continues to rise, the dollar is under threat, the banking system is under threat, and of course the U.S. consumer is under threat. And then, there, of course, there's the threats of domestic unrest, and you got a political season coming up in 2024, etc. So they have to keep the price of oil at a reasonable level at this point in time. But they don't, what they don't want to do is tap into their strategic oil reserve. Now, I'm not talking about the official strategic oil reserve that's in and around the Gulf Coast, those 4 reservoirs they fill. I'm not talking about that. You see, the real strategic oil reserve in the USA is all of those places where they want to drill but they can't because, or they say they can't for environmental reasons. One of the best strategic oil reserves is the one that you just keep in the ground for a rainy day. You don't have to build any facilities for it. I mean, you don't have to build these multi-million, billion-dollar storage facilities for that oil. a lot of that oil in the strategic oil reserve isn't refined. So, you still have to refine it. So having it in the ground, this is why people say, well, why don't we just drill over here and, just use up all the stuff we have. I believe that there's somebody with half a brain in the U.S. administration that sees the writing on the wall. They see that eventually because you have to understand, and going back, we're going to have an expert on oil on the channel next month. This guy just knows everything you could possibly imagine about oil, okay? And everything you know about oil, I assure you, is not necessarily wrong, but there's many, many angles to consider. The amount of energy, the amount of energy it takes to get a barrel of oil now is like 100 times more than it used to, okay? So yes, there's still an abundance of shale oil in North America, but it's very costly to extract, okay? And it might not seem that costly because there's certain other factors that keep the price down, technological deflationary pressures. But, and you might seem, well, why don't we just go and start, pumping this oil in Alaska? Somebody somewhere smart, and that's, saying a lot for the US government, or the Canadian government for that matter, has thought a few steps ahead. And they're saying, we need to try to get as much oil from overseas as we can while we still can, because when World War III starts, we may be cut off from that Saudi oil. We may not have access to it anymore. And if you can imagine, if you want to see global chaos on a massive scale, and we don't have the ability to be to have a domestically sustainable energy market, that's going to be shit hits the fan, okay, for the United States. So somebody is thinking, keep that oil in the ground for now. When the time comes, we'll deal with the environmentalists. That's what they're going to say. Environmentalists have never been able to save a single tree in history, and they never will, unfortunately. I mean, and I'm a person who loves nature. I love the outdoors. I love the wilderness. I want to preserve it for as long as possible. But at the end of the day, I do realize on the bend that we're currently on, I would not be surprised that if every organic thing on this planet eventually went extinct one day so that we can go and build Elon Musk's base on Mars or whatever. So right now they need to keep that inflation down. Now, what is China doing? China is increasing the amount of oil that they have. They are filling up not only their grain silos, just like North Korea, they're also stockpiling as much oil as they can, because the U.S. has a domestically sourceable and not unlimited, but a lot more oil. And of course, we do have Venezuela, which we could eventually come to terms with at some point, arguably. So, and they have a lot of oil. China doesn't have that. China needs some security in and around the Middle East in order to ensure that they have an infinite supply of oil. Now, you might say, well, Russia can continuously give them oil, but no nation wants to be beholden to just one primary supplier, which was the case with Russia and the natural gas fiasco. Europe wants to be beholden to liquefied natural gas from Europe instead, apparently. That was a sarcastic bad joke. China wants to have a diversified ability to get oil. Now, Saudi Arabia and Iran were supposed to enter BRICS, okay? So you really have this, what would we call it? I was going to say a threesome. Not a threesome. It's a love triangle between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. Okay, so Saudi Arabia being in the middle. Saudi Arabia is being pulled from one side to the other. They're being pulled into BRICS, and they're also being pulled into the Israeli sphere of influence. And so it's not surprising that all of this stuff got thrown into the mix right as BRICS was about to go down, as the Saudis were about to enter into talks with the Iranians, and arguably the Saudis were starting to make good with peace with Israel. Now, I haven't quite entirely understood who is instigating what in the Middle East. There's arguments to be made that Iran stands to benefit from what's going on right now in terms of this disruption, this October 7th flashpoint that created this cascading series of events that we're seeing unfold right now, or if it's just the military-industrial complex competing with the financial system and which one's going to go down first. But I do believe that the big money there in that region is banking on the U.S. military's presence as stabilizing oil prices. So I would not be surprised that in spite of these hijackings of vessels, okay, I would not be surprised if we seen a drop in oil price tomorrow. Hey, Dominic, what? Could you just turn that down a little bit, please? Yeah. All right, thanks. He's playing, what are you playing, Red Dead Redemption? Yeah, he's playing Red Dead Redemption. Anyways, cool game. Grand Theft Auto 6 is coming out soon. Boy, that's going to be a doozy, isn't it? Anyways, where was I? I was talking about big money is banking on the U.S. naval presence as stabilizing the force in the region. This is why they haven't went after the Houthis yet entirely. When they do, they're going to have to go all in, because if the Houthis are able to get some of those missiles through into the Saudi oil fields, it is lights out for the U.S. financial system. All right, now, immigration and Israel. Israel continues to do airstrikes on Damascus. Now, all of these far-right nut jobs who are coming into power, and look, I lean right, I lean left. You got to be a moving target. I'm very pro-gun. Look at this shirt, you know, pro-gun. There's arguments to be made for both sides of the spectrum at different times. I don't believe anybody, like, I mean, think about it. You're driving down a road. You're trying to get to a destination, the promised land, whatever. If you're always veering right, you're going to be going in circles. If you're always veering left, okay, so there's a time to swing left, time to swing right. But a lot of these very eccentric weirdos that are being elected right now who claim that they're for that, I want you to think about something. Now, the immigration crisis was caused by the war in Syria, one of them anyways, just one of many. I mean, all the Middle Eastern wars have contributed to Europe's immigration crisis, okay? Do you think that's going to get any better if Israel initiates another war, instigates another war, like they're doing right now in Syria? So all of these politicians, like the Dutch guy who's a staunch proponent of the Israeli cause, as is the Argentinian guy, do they not understand that in doing that, that they are going to actually contribute to more immigration, which is the basis for which they are going to be, or have been, or are about to be elected in the first place? So maybe they want to create the crisis, you know, like maybe they want the crisis so they can keep getting the votes, and they can keep saying, you know, it's kind of like, you know, as much as we all want crime to go down, no cop wants to lose his job at the end of the day. So you have a vested interest in crime continuing to rise. So maybe that's what it is. But this is just something I thought that it's an observation I've had, that all of these guys that claim to be tough on immigration are all into interventionist policies that cause these problems in the first place. And that's beyond evident again today. Damascus airport, a nation's sovereignty illegally infringed by a country that's just allowed to have nuclear weapons. It's allowed to do whatever the fuck it wants, apparently. Pardon my language. It's okay, he's got his headphones on now. The Black Sea corridor. Okay, this is like, what is this? Zelensky announced the imminent receipt of warships to escort grain tankers in the Black Sea. Now, number one, the Russians have threatened that they will target any grain ship, any commercial vessel. Apparently one blew up the other day. You didn't even hear about it, okay? They've said that they would explode any of these ships that they claim are illegally transiting or violation of the grain deal, which no longer exists, right? Now, something to think about is, number one, Russia could easily sink these warships. The fact that Ukraine hasn't had a navy up till this point to sink. So the Russians have a variety of options at their disposal to sink these warships. So I'm not really sure what they're hoping to achieve here. The Black Sea is busy, so you can't just be firing missiles all over the place. They're not, or at least they haven't been targeting these ships with their aircraft, okay? Now, maybe there's some unspoken agreement with Turkey that they can't, maybe that if Ukraine is within international waters off of, Bulgaria or one of these other NATO countries that's in the Black Sea, then maybe the Russians don't want to violate, so they don't want to, send a missile in. But sending in warships, number one, Is this NATO's way of testing what the Russians' capabilities are against their warships? Or are they just, is this just more guinea pig fodder for NATO's military industry in preparation for World War III? Because what this really all looks like now with Ukraine, it just was a testing ground for NATO weapons for when they have to go to war. And unfortunately, the Ukrainians are just expendable assets in this whole ploy to get prepared for fighting the Russians and the Chinese down the road. And this maps on, I just thought about this, to what Peter Vincent Pry was saying about the Spanish Civil War and how it was used as a testing ground to test out strategies which eventually were employed in World War II. Okay, and of course we all, and myself, I'm guilty of this, we all think the timelines are going to be far more rushed than they actually are. But the fact that they're agreeing to warships, the fact that Typhoon fighter jets, UK Typhoon fighter jets, claimed that they were going to be policing this corridor in the first place is absolutely insane. Because the whole reason why they needed a Green Deal with the Russians is because they were worried about NATO getting into a war with Russia. So now they're not worried about getting into a war with Russia? I don't know. I really don't know at this point. China and the United States. China accused the U.S. of illegally entering its territorial waters. The U.S. destroyer USS Hopper entered the country's territorial waters off the Jisha Islands illegally, according to the Chinese government. So we're already back to playing these games in the South China Sea. We're already back to calling Xi a dictator, and I'm pretty sure China knows what time it is, which is why they are building so many warships. One thing to keep in mind with sanctions, okay? I know I'm jumping all over the board. I promised you we're going to touch on everything today. I'm going to give you food for thought on all these critical issues. When I take a few days off, boy, does the brain get going. Something to think about with sanctions, and I brought this up probably many months ago. What happens when you force a man to operate with less is he starts to learn how to wield that with great efficiency. And he starts to become self-reliant. And he starts to be able to be more resilient than you, who are not alienated from the global community. You have benefited from these global supply chains all these years. Of course, I'm comparing the United States with heavily sanctioned countries like North Korea, like Iran, like Russia, well under the boot heel of international sanctions and these other forms of economic warfare. They will suffer immensely for decades, perhaps. But while suffering, they are slowly beginning to cultivate their own domestic industry in a way which will eventually make them more resilient and less susceptible to global disruptions in the supply chain. So all of these nations now, you're starting to see, even with the North Koreans, think about what they've done. There was a time 10 years ago in those North Korean military parades, those guys were skinny. They were dealing with widespread famine. I mean, you know, the material, the equipment was old. You're starting to see now in these military parades, they're starting to come back to life. They have a new vitality to them. The people there are a little bit plumper than they used to be. The weapon systems are more advanced. They're putting satellites into space, and the satellites aren't just some rinky-dink things. They actually look fairly sophisticated, okay? They look very well finished. And you're seeing the same thing with the Iranians. So sanctions work in the short term, but now you're starting to have the open sharing of technology between Belarus, Russia, Iran, Syria, North Korea, China. All of these countries are now just starting to create their own network. Well, of course, BRICS, right, is part of that. So I just wanted to say that about sanctions. So yeah, the sanctions are starting, and we're entering that period now where they're catching up in spite of the sanctions. And that's terrifying, because just imagine now if they were to somehow enter the global supply chain, right, with their hardened resilience. All of this suffering that the Russians are doing on the battlefield of Ukraine, it's not in vain from their perspective. Number one, they're gaining experience points. In video game speak, that's what's happening. They're gaining experience on the battlefield. And imagine how many of these guys who've been fighting in the trenches right now are going to go on to be officers in the future. They're going to be leveraged in the future wars with NATO. The U.S. doesn't have that. I mean, the best the U.S. has is the information that's being relayed by Ukrainians and their mercenaries who are on the front lines, but not to the extent that Russia has. So all the suffering that's happening under the sanctions, under the wars, will have a payoff at some point in time. Something to consider. The weather and warfare. Just a few considerations here. Southern Ukraine has been hit by a major storm. 0.5 million people are without power in Crimea. It also affected Odessa as well, only on that side of the river. It was snow on the Crimean side of the river, where it is more, I guess would the word be temperate sort of climate. They don't really get a lot of snow apparently. Then it's going to be a flood. It's going to be waves. It's going to be rain, that kind of thing. So understand that there is a window, and for a lot of people this is common knowledge, but it's just worth knowing that this will dictate the outcome of things. We've seen this in the past couple years, where had it been a very cold winter last year, we would have seen natural gas prices go through the roof. It just so happened it was one of the warmest years on record in Europe, okay? Warmest winters on record. Now, it's likely going to be very similar this year in spite of these blizzards that they're experiencing in and around Odessa, because this is something I check, because if you want to be a geopolitical analyst and you want to be accurate about your predictions and prognostications, you have to look at the weather, because that really does dictate everything. If they're expecting it to be a warmer than average winter, then that's going to factor in to the economics of war. So, you know, right now it's looking like it's going to be another warm winter in Europe, the next 10-day forecast, but, you know, anything can happen. So something to keep in mind. Another example of this is on the Taiwan Strait, okay? So the only times when it's feasible for China to do an actual landed invasion of Taiwan and send boats over the strait would be in the months of April and October. It's not that they couldn't do it at any other time, but that's when the seas are the calmest. So all I'm trying to say is, you know, there's that age-old saying about logistics, but the weather is everything, okay? And it's just something to consider. Speaking of weather, Brazil is in a dire state of drought, one of the worst droughts they've ever experienced. Now, this is the Amazon rainforest, okay? Emphasis on rainforest. And they are experiencing the largest drought. Most of Canada is in moderate to severe drought right now. Most of the southern United States and even parts of the grain belt are in drought. And we're just starting El Nino. So if this continues into next year, combined with the already background increases in global average temperature, we could see food prices skyrocket like you wouldn't believe next year. The U.S. is ramping up production of plutonium pits for nuclear weapons. Why are they doing this? Because they're spending $1.5 trillion to modernize their nuclear weapon systems. The other reason why is a lot of the treaties that they had with the Russians, and this might be part of the reason why they're abandoning those treaties, is that and there really is no treaties left. I think they're all gone now at this point for the most part. The reason why is that the Chinese never were factored into this calculus, okay? So I'm not sure what sort of treaties the French and the English have. Their nuclear stockpiles are limited anyways, but the U.S.'s argument is going to be we need to double our nuclear stockpile. And this is something to think about. Why is the price of uranium going up so much? Could it have something to do with the fact that they're maybe secretly building nuclear weapons, or not so secretly? Because we know that they're going to be increasing the amount of nuclear weapons. The U.S. now needs to make sure it can match not only Russia, but both China. Okay, now something to think about here is what happens when, you know, China wants to match the United States and Russia. And it just seems like it could be a runaway thing where we get into another arms race where we continuously ramp up nuclear weapons. I do believe that nuclear weapons will be utilized someday. And the danger at this point in time is that they will be utilized and normalized for tactical purposes. There may be a world that we can envision where the use of low-yield tactical nuclear weapons becomes accepted on the battlefield. I know there's a lot of analysts who believe that immediately the use of a small, little, tiny David Crockett-style nuke is going to elicit a strategic nuclear response, but I don't think so. I think if anything, what we've seen, especially in the last few years, is that things are not the worst case that we always envision, like the pandemic, for instance. If anything, yes, it showed the vulnerabilities in the system, but it also showed the resiliency of many components of the system. And even with this managed escalation we're seeing with NATO and Ukraine, I mean, the fact that Moscow has just endured its largest ever attack, and there still hasn't been a nuclear weapon used, is insane to most people who are, have their nose in this kind of stuff. So anyways, I just think that's food for thought. USA and Israel, Biden is moving to lift all restrictions on Israeli access to US weapons. All restrictions. So what, they're going to get the new stealth bomber as well? I mean, this is insane. This really makes you wonder, I mean, who is really... Never mind, let's not go there. The Baltics. Estonia is installing additional dragon's teeth on its border with Russia. Everything I say on this channel, I don't do conspiracy. I don't do, even fringe ideas like weather modification. I just don't go there, okay? Everything I say can be fact-checked. Go on the internet. So if you think that any of this stuff is out of the realm of plausibility, then I would encourage you to just go and check it out, okay? Because this is all happening as we speak, okay? There's 3 aircraft carriers from UK, I believe, is it UK, France, and some other country in the Baltic Sea right now, while Estonia is installing additional dragon teeth on its border. These are anti-tank barriers that they put up. The Norwegian Prime Minister has assessed the situation on the border with Russia. Now, they're saying this is all for an immigrant crisis. Now, why would Russia, what would they stand to gain by creating this immigrant crisis on the borders? Knowing what they know about NATO's concerns about potentially going to war with them and mobilizing from war and executing Schengen, or about to anyways, which will allow free flow of military equipment across all borders in Europe. Knowing this, why would they want to provoke that? Okay? This is something that people need to consider. I mean, if you have all these immigrants on the Russian border trying to get into NATO countries, that doesn't speak too highly of those immigrants' desire to remain inside Russia. If Russia was better, then why wouldn't they want to stay, right? So it does start to look like they... maybe they are. Maybe this is just a way to try to bring back the Iron Curtain and try to dissuade, people from leaving the country because they know they're going to have to mobilize them for war soon. Maybe that's what this is about. If you guys have any thoughts on that one, let me know in the comments section below. And of course, Finland is on the brink of completely shutting down its border. Okay. Speaking about the accusation against Russian border guards, Peskov has emphasized that they will comply with all instructions. The border crossing is used by those who have the legal right to do so. But yeah, something is up. Russia is definitely up to some sneaky business on that front that I can't quite fully comprehend what is happening. Now, the AI warning, I talked about this in previous videos, but it bears repeating because this is something that gets no attention. Vladimir Putin said a few years ago, he distinctly said, whoever gets AI first will rule the world. Now, if you knew that your adversary was about to get something that would enable them to rule the world, don't you think you would do every single thing that within your realm of capability to do to prevent them from doing that? Don't you think that might be what that might be the trigger for your use of cyber weapons, nuclear weapons. If you knew that getting AI would allow you to effectively neutralize, or your adversary to completely neutralize your strategic arsenal, so make your nuclear weapons obsolete, then wouldn't you do anything to get the jump on that? Like maybe even starting a war. Now, we can presume that the Russians are far behind the United States in terms of AI. Far behind in the sense of 5-10 years, who knows? And this, of course, a lot of this is contingent on the nanometer chips, the nanoscale chips. The best chips in the world still come from TSMC in Taiwan. Now, some people say, well, you don't need the absolute best chips to have the best AI. You just need a lot of data, a lot of bandwidth, and yeah, you need the quantum. You can get into the quantum computing thing. You pair the quantum computing with the AI, with the, some unlimited energy source and robotics, and that's, there's your dystopia in a nutshell. But this is important. This is something that people need to be aware of, is that there could very well be this war. Now, what you're seeing with ChatGPT, I'm sure this has caught the attention of the Chinese and the Russians, because they might be thinking to themselves, what if everything we're doing here is just going to be made obsolete by whatever this AI is able to create? Okay, so something to think about. I told you I was going to give you guys things to think about today, and I hope I was able to deliver on that promise. Once again, last chance, last few hours, go and capitalize on that Black Friday deal. 15% off store-wide. Get freeze-dried food. It's only going to increase in value. Stock up on the meats. Stock up on, I don't think any of our products are going to deflate. At least not until these wars come to an end. I mean, if the wars were to come to an end tomorrow, we could see incredible deflation. But then again, you might have people blowing up the stock market once again, and it might just be another Wojak situation where he pumps all his money into crypto, and there we are back into this market melt up sort of cycle where everybody's spending again, and that spending will create more demand that will increase. Anyways, the whole drill. So I would just encourage people, get the deals while you can. I'm going to be doing a review of this tent. This tent is freaking, it's out of this world, man. I mean, it is just incredible. The value that you get with this tent is incredible. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. And I'm not going to tell you what it is yet. You're just going to have to guess. But it's different, put it that way. It's something you probably have never seen before and you never thought was possible. It's something that you think is probably a stupid idea when you first hear about it. But I tell you, man, this thing is freaking insane. And it's Russian. So, of course, it's big. Guys, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Canadian Prepper out, and stay tuned because we got a lot of great guests and content coming your way.